Obviously, I advertise this as Chaucer's Gnof, but I'd like to broaden it out just a little bit to bring in the book first. Um, and to think a little bit more about the evidence that we use in writing literary history. I have two very specific arguments that I'd like to present today about why I think we can say Chaucer knew Boccaccio's Decameron probably better than perhaps many other people reading the Decameron have known it. You may find them outrageous arguments, but they're very different. They are very different. And I think they raise this broader question of how do we find evidence and use that evidence for doing literary history. So I'd like to broaden the talk a little bit. One of them is the claim, one of my bits of very specific evidence is the claim that Chaucer took 3 tales from the Decameron in order to write the Shipman's tale. He saw what Boccaccio was doing in dividing one story over 3 tales, and Chaucer then boiled them back down into one story, which is the Shipman's tale. I don't see where else he could have gone to get that aside from the Shipman's tale. So I think, in my mind, that's pretty convincing. And that's the part of the book that I'd like to be talking about today. The second point, though, and I've tried this with people, and I've shown them the book and asked them to read it, and they've still said to me, if we don't have literary borrowings, if we don't have direct textual evidence, parallels from one text to the other, then I'm still not going to believe it. You can tell me about 3 stories all you want, but I know how Chaucer translated, and he translated word by word. You can see it in The Knight's Tale, you can see it in other things that Chaucer translated. So they say without those sort of verbal echoes, that's the word I'm looking for, without verbal echoes, we're just not going to believe it. So Gnof, I believe, is a verbal echo. On the other hand, I'm going to argue that Chaucer chose to use Gnof precisely because he didn't expect anyone to understand it. So you can see I have a little bit of a tough row to hoe here. Oh, this I should have warned you. This is an image that we will come to at the end of the paper. I'd just like to embed it in your minds for a moment so you're aware of the difficulty that I'm up against in making the argument that I'm making today. But in any case, my claim is that he takes this word gnaffé from Decameron 3:4, and we'll come to this at the end, and uses the sound of the word at the opening of Chaucer's Miller's Tale. Whilom there was dwelling at Oxenford, a riche Gnof, the guest is held to board. So he borrows the sound of the word, but he doesn't borrow the meaning of the word. So you can see, I think, that we've got to err into a broader literary interpretation in order to make these bits of evidence come to bear on the Decameron question in some way. The question is, why, if there are 3 tales from the Decameron that Chaucer is using in the Shipman's Tale, why hasn't this been recognized up to this particular point? And with the other bit of evidence, the Gnof evidence, why in heaven's name would Chaucer do something as crazy as borrowing the sound of a word but not the meaning of the word? So my opening point is that even though when we talk about sources and analogs, we kind of think we don't need to do literary interpretation. That can be something that can come afterwards. I'm arguing that even with source study, it's got to be grounded in some kind of literary interpretation. You guys are going to need some explanation for why these things have happened before you're going to believe them. So, we'll stop there. If there is this connection between Chaucer and the Decameron, then it's going to open up, I think, a lot of different conclusions about the way we think about the Canterbury Tales. And there may not be a lot of time to talk about that at the end, so let me just say here, the conclusions I'd like you to consider as I'm talking. First and foremost, that Chaucer had read the Decameron closely, that he thought about it precisely, that he uses it to write the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. He finds in it a method that allows him to write the Shipman's Tale, the Miller's Tale, and then realized that the Shipman's tale isn't appropriate for the wife of Bath. And so he then turns around and writes the wife of Bath's tale. Now, once we have that method that he's taken from Boccaccio, I think we can also see, and this is in the book, but I won't necessarily go into it here unless people want to talk about it, I think we can see that that gives us a way to say that Chaucer's wife of Bath's tale is the direct source for Gower's tale of Florent. We can date, in other words, the beginning of Chaucer's work on the Canterbury Tales, those three tales, to before 1390, because that's when the first version of the Confessio Amantis comes out. So that to me would be conclusions. Those are speculative. Those are things that we can talk about more if you're interested in at the end. But this basic notion that we need some kind of explanation for how literary history unfolds in order to understand the evidence of source study, I think is something that I hope you'll agree as we move through. In any case, I don't want to take all night. In dealing with Boccaccio and Chaucer, we're dealing with, as you all know better than I do, major figures. This is Vasari's, the 6 Tuscan poets, the version in Oriel College. Boccaccio, of course, is the wasted one between Petrarch and Dante. Do you all know this? No, you don't actually. So this one is Boccaccio right here in the middle with the laurel wreath around. Of course, Petrarch and Dante at the other end. Guido Cavalcanti is in there. The others are all there too. You'll notice there are 5, not 6, in the Oriel College version. This is the Minneapolis Art Institute copy of the same painting. And you can see all 6 of the Tuscan poets painted in 1544, so a little bit later, but just nice to have an image of this. Do you know this image? Is this an image you've ever run across? This is the beginning of a Decameron manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale. This is the opening of the Decameron. And so what I think we have here is Boccaccio reading the Decameron to a group of women with Cupid over top. This is the opening image. The interest of this manuscript is that it may be based on a manuscript that Boccaccio himself approved of. So it's a kind of, maybe an early image, fairly generic perhaps, but a perhaps early image of Boccaccio and how he wanted himself represented at this point. Chaucer, we all know from obvious images, but I'm glad Tony's here because he can tell us more about this one. This is the Takamiya manuscript that has just been given to the Beinecke, and Tony and Julia were both there for that wonderful occasion a couple of weeks ago. Do you guys know this image? We probably know it because Alistair Minnis has put it on his new Cambridge companion to Chaucer, Cambridge. But I don't understand why this image isn't better known, and I'm going to turn to you guys to tell me this at the end. It's, of course, a young, blonde Chaucer sitting in a garden. This is Juan that April, so this is the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. And it's just a stunningly beautiful image. This is one of the 300 or so manuscripts that Professor Takamiya gathered, collected during his life, and have been recently given to Yale University. So we have them our side of the ocean at this moment. I just say that to make you jealous, I hope, at this point. The reason for talking about these two people and the connections between them is because, of course, their lives overlapped. Chaucer is in Pisa in 1372, 1373. He could have met Boccaccio at this point. There are no records that he did. I think most scholars would agree it's probably not until his second journey to Italy in 1378 that he actually goes to the Visconti libraries in Pavia and Milan and gets copies of the Boccaccio stories that he uses. And that's what I'm assuming as well. It would have been during that second version that Chaucer would have gotten his hands on a Decameron. But it's kind of cool that they could, of course, have met, but we have no evidence that they did. Why do we believe that there's some connection between the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales? It seems absolutely obvious until you start looking at it. They're similarly framed stories, and they have 5 or 6 stories that directly overlap. How can Chaucer not have known the Decameron, I think, is something one could ask. The problem, obviously, is, again, I'm sure you're all aware, is that there are no, up to this particular point, there are no stories that exist exclusively within the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales. And so we're caught in this kind of situation of saying similar, but it turns out other versions are more similar. And the extreme example of this is, of course, the Clerk's Tale, where the clerk has the chance to say, yes, yes, this comes as the last story of the Decameron, but instead officially identifies Petrarch as his source for that story. So if Chaucer knew and was influenced by the Decameron, why not say it at that moment? Helen Cooper has, I think, articulated this very well when she said, Chaucer had read or heard the Decameron while in Italy, conceivably even from an Italian merchant in London, but did not have a copy of his own to set in front of him while he was writing. And so Cooper's view would be he knew it, but he just didn't have it with him. And so he gathered similar kinds of stories, and that's why there's the overlap between the two. The person I object to, well, not object to, no one can object to Helen Cooper. I laugh about the book being a long love letter to Helen Cooper that unfortunately failed. No, Fred, she says, you're wrong. You're still wrong. And someday I'll convince her, maybe not, as the case may be. Warren, on the other hand, Ginsberg has worked on this for many years. His book, Teller's Tales in Translation, came out in 2016. At the very end of the whole book, he decides, he doesn't really address the question. It's not a theory of translation that interests him. But as a kind of throwaway remark at the end of the book, he says, I believe that Chaucer had at most only heard about the Cento Novelle contra la Morte. So really no connection at all in Warren's version, in Warren's view. I think the reason that we haven't seen it is because we haven't understood how Chaucer has used the Decameron. And so to me, the starting point for this is the Shipman's Tale and 8.1, 8.2, and 8.10. 8.1 and 8.2 are the ones that everyone has talked about up to this particular point. 8.10 is the one that's a little more obscure. How many people don't know their Decamerons? Okay, so we better, you've read it, but may not have the plots completely under control. Let's try and get into 8.2 this way. This is a little short 6-line Latin poem that I think is probably the source for 8.2. This is probably what Boccaccio had at his fingertips. And it's kind of nice that there's a copy at Eton College. There are about 15 copies of this that have been identified in 13th and 14th century manuscripts. So it's quite likely that Chaucer too would have known it or might have known it. In any case, a clerk, I'm going to read off this, won a soldier's wife with, as payment, a cloak. And that very one secretly took a pepper mill. The next morning he returns, giving the mill back to the husband who is there. Give me back the cloak. I'm returning the mill, he said. Give it back, says the husband. I will, answers the wife, but this one will grind no more in our mill. Now, is that intelligible to you? Do you understand what's going on here? More or less. So there is a clerk who wants to sleep with someone, but she refuses unless she gives him his cloak. Gives her his cloak. I'm going to get the genders wrong. But then as he's leaving, he regrets leaving behind his cloak, so he steals a pepper mill and then waits till the husband and wife are together, returns the pepper mill with a note saying, here's your pepper mill back, but I want my cloak. The husband gets mad at the wife for having insisted on collateral, and so returns without understanding what's going on. You're supposed to be laughing. This is supposed to be a little funny story. What it is a Latin rendering of a folk tale. This is a genuine folk tale. This is the kind of short body story that did circulate from the 12th up through the 15th and on up into more modern times. But what's happened here is that it's been turned into a Latin form that makes it easily transmittable, easily recordable. The Decameron A2 is set in Varlungo, so it's set in a hamlet, and basically what Boccaccio has done is he's taken this poem and taken the pepper mill out of it. He's returned it back into a very peasant society, a peasant world. And so it's the same kind of thing. The priest comes, wants to sleep with the woman, leaves behind a cloak, lots of joking about the cloak. He steals not a pepper grinder, but he steals a mortar and pestle as he's leaving, which is, I think, a little bit lower class. I think it's Boccaccio sort of realizing the pepper might be a luxury item. The word for cloak there, too, the CLAMS, is also a kind of obscure word, and I think it's a play by the Latin poet in, the unlikeliness of this happening that way. In any case, that's the folktale version of the whole thing. What Chaucer's scholars knew, because people had been reading Boccaccio and Chaucer together, for years, for centuries. They knew this story, but they also knew the first story of the eighth day. And this is the image in the manuscript that had the initial of Boccaccio. This is, again, we're back in that same Paris manuscript. And this is the story you know from the Shipman's Tale. Anyone not know the Shipman's Tale? Okay, but that's a little bit more familiar. Okay, Henrika, we'll see if we can get you on board with this. This is a German mercenary living in Milan who decides he wants to have an affair with the wife of a wealthy merchant. As soon as he proposes this, she says, "Fine, but I'd like 200 florins for this." And his great love turns into hatred. And so he decides he's going to beat her at her own game. So this is the image of him borrowing the money from the husband so he can come with a friend to the wife, giving that same money to her. She counts it out on the table. The friend disappears. They disappear off into the bedroom. And what we don't get in the illustration either is the husband will eventually come home and he'll be told by the mercenary in the presence of his friend that the money has been returned. Now, the problem is that these stories were being thought about as similar kinds of folk tales, just similar versions, slightly different versions of the same story, because these two stories have been associated together for so long. And so I think, John, it's Scattergood, isn't it, who in the most recent Sources and Analogues volume ends up discussing 8.1 and 8.2 as the major possible sources for the Shipman's Tale, but assumes that they're really just versions of a folk legend that's been passed down. What people haven't thought about, and this is what I'd like to call your attention to today, is 8.10, the last story of the eighth day of the Decameron. And it's fabulous. If you don't have 8.10 in the back of your minds, you've just got to go back and reread it, because it's a wonderful story about a Florentine merchant who shows up in Palermo with company goods, which he checks into a warehouse. The people working in the warehouse and the local prostitutes are in league with each other. And so the prostitutes know exactly how much the money is valued for. So Gianco Fiore, the woman here, is a local prostitute courtesan. She knows how much this guy is worth and she's going to get the money. So she seduces him. This is her passing him money rather than him passing her money. She puts on the appearance of being a very wealthy woman. In order to win him over, and then takes him off to the bagno, as it's described in the text. The artist has moved it outside, which I think is really kind of wonderful. So the seduction takes place. We better go through it. The goods are sold. The courtesan knows how much he's worth. She comes up with a story about her brother is going to be murdered unless she can come up with twice the amount of money. Salabetto is so over his head in love that he gives her all the company money without worrying about it. She cuts off the affair. Several months later, he realizes she's cut off the affair and he's not going to get the company money back. He takes off to Naples to visit a close family friend who solves the problem for him. So he comes back to Palermo with a new shipment of goods valued at 6 times the original amount, checks him into the dogana. Of course, Giancafiore, the woman, hears about it, decides she sold herself too cheap. She tries to begin the affair, apologizing first for having not returned the original money. Salabetto says he's furious, but he loves her so much that he's come back with all of his goods, half of which are now here, in order to live in Palermo with her forever. Life will be wonderful. The affair begins. He's gotten the original company money back at this point. The affair begins again. He then waits a month or so and announces that pirates have captured the second shipment of goods. And so he's got to raise money very quickly in order to be able, or he's going to lose 3 times the amount of the shipment. Giancafiore says, gee, I'd love to loan you the money, but I just happen to be a little short today. 1,000 florins is beyond what I can come up with immediately. But she knows someone who could loan it to him if he has collateral. And so he says, sure, we'll use the goods already in the warehouse as the collateral. They're valued at 3 times the amount we're talking about. We don't have to worry about that. So he gets his 500 back, and then he gets 1,000 more, and he takes off back for Naples. Giancafiore, it's such a great story. The story ends with Giancafiore breaking into the warehouse to find the casks of oil are really seawater with a little bit of oil on the top, and the great big bales of cloth are really all just straw with a little bit of cloth hanging out the end. It's a brilliant story. It's an absolutely brilliant story. What we think of it as is the deceiver deceived. And so Giancafiore has tricked Salabetto into believing that he's wealthy, and then she herself is tricked at the end by this play that he makes. But what it also is, I think very clearly, is the lover's gift regained. It's 8-1, 8-2, but it's no longer in a hamlet or in a city. It's now in the world of international commerce. It's down on the lower, Wall Street or the city, or do you know what I mean? It's a story about how bankers live and work. So what Boccaccio has done here is he's taken one story and told it in 3 economic settings. And it's suddenly 8-1 is not another folktale version of something. It's Boccaccio's first literary play on a folktale. And then 8-10 confirms that by being a second literary play on a folktale. Chaucer looked at it, and he looked at it again, and he probably knew the damned poem, and he said, oh my God, he did that. He took that story and divided it into 3 separate stories. I can do something even cooler. I can do it in one story. I'm going to write the Shipman's Tale. So how are we doing on time, by the way? Because we have to get to Gnof. I promised people Gnof. How much time have we spent? 20 minutes, okay. So about halfway. I'll speed up a little bit. The basic story of the Shipman's Tale is 8-2, isn't it? The borrowing of the money and the returning. But what Chaucer very carefully does in the Shipman's Tale is he makes the lover into a monk. He is a perfect representative of the older feudal society. Cool, the wine arrives. I will try and talk over the wine coming in. So it's set in Saint-Denis. It's set in a place like Milan, but if we know anything about Saint-Denis, we realize how brilliant Chaucer's setting is, because Saint-Denis is an old fair town set up by Dagobert, and then reappointed as being a fair town in the 11th and 12th century, and then is surpassed by the Foire de Champagne. It would have been a place that Chaucer would have known as an urban center, not really urban, but urban-like center, which has been itself at the center of change. He has a merchant and his wife, which would be similar to A2, but he gives us then, as the lover, this representative of feudal society who breaks into the family by constantly giving gifts. The wine and the fowl and everything else that he brings to that house is a recurring motif in that tale. But then what he does too is he introduces the whole world of banking into that story, well beyond what he needs to do. The husband leaves Saint-Denis to go up to Bruges in order to make the deal, and then has to come back through Saint-Denis back down to Paris in order to pay off the deal. All of the international banking is worked into that story in a way that doesn't have to be there. In other words, Chaucer uses the three economic settings, but recombines them back down into an individual story. Now, for the literary history of this, why did Chaucer do it? I think Chaucer saw, and again, I'm not a Boccaccio scholar, and so forgive me if anyone here is and would like to challenge this, but I think Chaucer saw the incredible misogyny of 8.1. 8.1 suggests that a woman who gives herself for love deserves a lenient judge, but a woman who gives herself for money deserves to be burned at the stake, right? And it's incredibly harsh. It's incredibly harsh in the misogyny of this. I think Chaucer looked at it and, thinking about the wife of Bath, said, hang on a minute. Let's think about the economic basis of marriage. Let's think about how marriage actually works and how women have to control their bodies and their money for marriage to work. So he saw the misogyny that Boccaccio lessens by telling it in the village, and then lessens by telling it in the world of international commerce, but it's still a deeply misogynistic story. And Chaucer turns it into a story that allows him to reflect on the economics of marriage. So I think that's the reason that he's drawn to it and just blown away by what happens in that story. We can go further into why it doesn't work for the wife of Bath, but let's plow on if we can. Because I guess, why hasn't anyone recognized this? Let me just underline that one more time. I think it's because our early work on sources for Chaucer was being systematized at a moment when folklore was at its high point. We all believed that folk tales were the way all of these narratives were transmitted throughout Western Europe. And we didn't pay enough attention to the literary transmission of these stories. There are some real folk tales, there's no doubt about it. I think 8.2 represents a folktale version. I think that Latin poem represents a folktale version. But I don't think 8.1 is, and I'm absolutely certain 8.10 isn't. Those are literary uses of a folktale that then Chaucer can use in the Shipman's tale. We're in a different kind of world. And I think people have just overlooked it because 8.10 is just too different a kind of story for us to say, yeah, it's just a folktale. And it wasn't absorbed into the Chaucer world because 8.1 is the one that's closest to what Chaucer's doing in the Shipman's tale, if that makes sense. We can come back to any of that didn't, but let's move on to Gnof if we can. How does a Gnof fit into Oxford? Now, let's think about this for a minute. We all know Willem there was dwelling at Oxenford, right? So the opening lines of the Miller's Tale introduce John the carpenter as a rich Gnof who happens to live in Oxford, having guests at his particular place. It's an interesting word, though, because it occurs here and only here in Middle English. There are no other Gnofs in Middle English. It has no good etymology, and it causes trouble for at least 6 scribes of the Canterbury Tales who change Gnof to other kinds of words, usually similar. So Goff is one reading, chuff is another reading, chuffer is a third, and then churl gets used in one of the manuscripts too. And looking at Tony, I realize I'm going to get asked harshly about this, but any further? Okay, just continue on? Okay, I'll continue on. The comments will come later at this point. In any case, no good etymology, only here and only here, causes some trouble in the manuscripts. But why do lexicographers believe it's a real word? They believe it's a real word because there are about 15 occurrences of it in early modern English. We've got to explain away the early modern English in order to doubt the truth of this being a real word. And I finally, in working on this paper, I finally realized the way to try and introduce this idea is to ask you if, in your opinion, brillig is a word. And then to turn around and ask you if you think chortle is a word. Is brillig a word? Is chortle a word? And that's obviously why we have that particular image up here, not only because it's a great hall, and we need a big hall in order for the Miller's Tale to work, but it's one of those Oxford colleges, Christ Church, it's Lewis Carroll's college. And so is brillig a word, is chortle a word? My basic argument here is going to be Gnof is a brillig word. Gnof is like brillig. It's a word that's associated. It's a strong word that appears at a surprising place in a text. People latch onto it and use it, even though it remains confined to that particular text. We might as well do chortle at this moment, too. You all realize that you all know Jabberwocky? 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. But Lawrence, never heard of Jabberwocky? But couldn't recite it off the top of your head? Lewis Carroll, obviously, it's one of the more memorable of the Alice poems. And brillig appears as the second word, but chortle appears much later on in it. He comes marching back with the Jabberwock's head in his hand, and he chortled in his joy. That's the first occurrence of the word chortle. That's made up by Lewis Carroll at that particular moment. It enters into the vocabulary because it sounds like chuckle and because it's used in a context that makes it mean something. Brillig doesn't enter into the vocabulary of the English language because 'twas brillig doesn't mean anything. The hour of the day, Carroll tells us, when you begin broiling things for dinner, explains brillig. He's just laughing at us at this particular point. In any case, Gnof, I'm arguing, is a brillig word. But the real problem of this is that we've got to explain these 15 independent uses of the word Gnof in the early modern time period. And again, to break this down as simply as I can, these uses occur between 1552 and 1626 at a time when the English were believing that Middle English vocabulary was becoming increasingly incomprehensible to them. This is the time of the inkhorn debates. Do we use real English words, hanging on to them, even though they may not mean what we think they mean? Or do we use Latinate words and French words, the words that are coming into the language at this point? So my basic argument is going to be that these 15 independent uses of the word Gnof between 1552 and 1626 are all by people who know Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. They're all associating Gnof back to, maybe not all of them, but there aren't enough of them for it to finally get into the general vocabulary. Yeah, and it would be interesting, I guess we could go off on this in questions too. Chaucer is, of course, being extensively edited at this point by people with antiquarian interests. And one of the most interesting editions that we could talk about is the Spade edition of, I think it's 1599 and then a second edition in 1600. What's so cool about that Spade edition is we get lists of difficult words at the back of that edition. And sure enough, the word Gnof appears as a difficult word in the Spade edition, suggesting that he didn't know it from any place else. He's criticized by his contemporaries for not providing etymologies for his words. And so the later version, in fact, identifies the language from which these difficult words come. Now, you'll never guess where Gnof comes from. Believe it or not, it's Italian. Wouldn't it be fabulous if they told us why it was Italian? And I think the best answer, I think, is the "gn" beginning of the word just can't appear many places. At least Italian is a possibility for it. Time. How much more do you want of this? How fast do we run? Okay, so we'll run a little bit quicker. Alexander Neville would be a good example of somebody who uses the word Gnof, and this is, of course, the Parker Library, a horrible picture, but his Latin secretary, Matthew Parker's Latin secretary, was a guy named Alexander Neville, and he writes an account of Kett's Rebellion, which takes place in 1549. What's cool about it is that at a key moment, the rebels decide they're going to leave a better fortified place to run off to some place which is not as well fortified, and they get slaughtered. The reason they do it is because they believe in this prophecy, and Neville gives us the prophecy. The country Gnofis, Hob, Dick, and Hick, with clubs included shown, shall fill up Dusendal with slaughtered bodies soon. And so, there's a good example of Gnof being used in a popular form, right? Prophecy, people running around saying it. What's the problem? What's interesting is that there's probably a source. There's way too many words on this, so we'll cut to this very quickly. But a guy named Nicholas Southerton writes the commotion, in Norfolk, which is probably the source for what Neville is writing in his Latin account. It's a little bit tricky to say, but what's interesting is this, he describes this same moment when they leave their better fortified position, and he refers down at the bottom there to their following prophecies to do it. And that in Dusensdale, there they perish, both great and small, which in them that after fell out. But their construct was that they should win the battle of their enemies and put them to flight. So this is this idea of there being a prophecy, but that prophecy being obscure. They don't quite know what it means. So I think, and there's a kind of maybe close enough sense of what that prophecy would have included. You compare that to what Neville gives us, the country Gnofs, Hob, Dick, and Hick. This is an upper class Latinist sneering at peasants who are out of control at this particular moment. And how do you do it? You use a good peasant word from Chaucer in order to sneer at them. Neville, I think, would be a good example of someone in the circles who would have been reading the Canterbury Tales. Those editions would have ended up in Parker's library and other educated people's libraries. But this becomes a chance for him to use that word in a context that's like Hob and Dick and Hick. It's sneering at them. Take William Baldwin, although we're not sure it's really William Baldwin. Every rich Gnof may up to heaven as easily stee, as may the wheeled unruly beast pass through a needle's ear, or eye and sty. Forgive me, I'm not sure the pronunciation at this moment. This is obviously a paraphrase of Matthew 19:26, isn't it? It's easier for the camel to pass through the eye of the needle than it is for the rich man to make it into heaven. But once you get rich in a learned circle, if you've been reading your Chaucer, men become Gnofs very quickly. So the rich is enough here in order to get the Gnof to appear. Here's a list of all of the people who use Gnof. And, the early modernists we could blow it up and we could talk about any more of them that you want to. But the point is that these people, by and large, have attended either Oxford or Cambridge or associated with the Inns of Court. This is a very specialized group of people who are using this word. The word doesn't appear in the Independent. The word doesn't appear in more common forms. It appears in these literary forms from literate people. And then it dries up. So here's my brillig and chortle, Jabberwocky, Humpty Dumpty saying words mean what I think they mean. This is a kind of brillig word, I think, is what Gnof is. So the question is, why would Boccaccio have been interested in the word gnaffa in any case, if there is a direct link between this gnaffa and Gnof, as I'm trying to argue here? And it goes back to, I think, one of the major sources for the Miller's Tale. This is Decameron 3:4, and very, very quickly, it's the story of a monk who finds out that one of his parishioners is more interested in saving his soul than in paying attention to his beautiful young wife. And so he devises a penitential exercise for the husband so he and the wife can share the bed in the next room. So it's a wonderful story, and it comes to a climax on a certain night when the husband is standing with his arms outstretched and feels a vibration in the floor. So he calls into his wife and says, "What's going on in there?" And she responds, "Gnaffa, marito mio. By my faith, my husband, I've been fasting with you, and you know how hard it is to sleep if you're hungry. And so that's why I'm shaking here in bed." So they get a good laugh out of it. But the story, I think, is close to the Miller's Tale because it's the use of religion in order to attain the end that you want. So Nicholas's prediction of a flood, it seems to me, is not far off of, and other people have suggested this as a parallel analog. I think it's closer than an analog, though. I think it's the story, one of the stories that Boccaccio is really working from as a source. In any case, he hears this gnaffa, by my faith. But it's Tuscan dialect. So he's absolutely certain that there are nobody in England who's reading the Decameron. He knows there are very few people in England who speak Italian, and he's pretty sure there are even fewer that are going to have a dialect at the back of their mind. But still, the question is, why do it at all? What's his reason for doing this? He wants the Miller's Tale to respond to the Knight's Tale on a theological level. The Knight's Tale is a story that explains a Neoplatonic universe. This is the fair chain of love that figures so prominently at the end of the Knight's Tale. It is a perfectly ordered divine universe in which nobles happen to be at the top of the social hierarchy because they're noble. The Miller's Tale has to go to the other extreme. It's going to be a story in which God gets born in a manger, and it's going to be I don't think Chaucer's making a theological statement, but I think he's thinking about theology and using theology to use the Miller's Tale to respond back to the Knight's Tale. He's interested in a kind of clash of social hierarchies at this particular point. So he likes this idea that behind this word, in my faith, is a kind of religious meaning that may be appropriate, that he finds funny and that he finds amusing. I guess the point I'll try and end with then is that if you drop out the Gnof in this opening lines, what you're left is this guy lives in Oxford, but he is a carpenter. He's a carpenter living in Oxford. And I think this is the first of our ways of Chaucer starting to make a series of odd allusions to Joseph and Mary and the Immaculate Conception that are going to run through this particular tale. John is ultimately a dumb guy who's there at the time that Christ is born, but is really more worried about the inexplicable pregnancy of his wife rather than he is about the birth of God at this particular moment. I think it's a profound response back to the theology of the Knight's Tale. Sorry, I could have done the end of this better, but we can clear up stuff if we want to in questions. Let me just end, though. If this is a verbal echo, it's a really cool verbal echo, isn't it? It's a kind of stunning. It's not Chaucer taking long passages from Boccaccio's work, but Chaucer turning to Boccaccio's work to see ideas and to see how those ideas can be expressed in narrative. And he can do it in the Shipman's Tale, and he can do it with Gnof or Gnof. It's the idea that you catch and you write your narrative around, and so you're not going to get those kind of verbal echoes out of the whole thing. I think I'm going to stop there because I think we'd be better off with questions at this moment. Is that okay? Thank you.